Hi, and welcome to part 2 of Module 2, Python Basics. And in this module, we're going to look at loops, for loops and while loops, and then iterating over a list. And then in the next video, we'll continue with data structures. So let's begin with loops. So there are two types of loops to know, for loops and while loops. For loops are good for, like I mentioned, iterating over a sequence such as a list, and so going through each of those elements in a list, maybe checking for some sort of condition or doing some mathematical operation or other operation on the elements in a list. So for loops are one way to accomplish that. And we'll look at an example here. So we have some list and we just have some numbers in here, 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. Now our for loop structure is going to always start with for, so that's how you would know it's a for loop. For I, so this I, lowercase I, is just a placeholder, and that's just going to represent each item in the list here. And so for each item in the list, in some list, so this is the sum list again, and then do something. So in this case, the new list will equal each item in the list multiplied by 10. So this should create a new list of 10, 30, 50, 70, and 90. Now, as we see here, we only end up with 90, so the last item of the list, and that's because we did not have a new list to put these new values in. And so each time this for loop was going through, it was overriding the previous step. And so it did create a list with 10, or a new item with 10, but then that was replaced by 30, and then that was replaced by 50, so on until you ended up with 90. So if we want to put each of these new values into its own list, we need to initialize an empty list to start. And so this will be an example of that. So we have our same sum list here, so 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, but now we're going to create a new list, and we're going to leave that empty. So we're just initializing it, and it's going to be an empty list. But as we use the for loop to go through this list, we're going to put each of these values into this new list, so it won't be empty for long. Now we have our same structure here, so the for loop for I in some list, but now we're going to take this new list and append or add each of these elements times 10. And so now when we print the new list, we're going to end up with what we thought we would have had the first time, so 10, 30, 50, 70, and 90. And so this shows you the basic setup for iterating through a list and doing some sort of calculation or operation on each of the items in the list. Now for a more practical example, let's look at medication dose based on a patient's weight. So we have a list of patient weights in kilograms, and that's patient weights kilograms, 60, 70, 80, 90, and 100. And we have a list, so we have this patient list of patient weights in kilograms, and we want to dose a particular medication at 0.25 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So let's initialize this empty list, so the medication doses in milligrams based on the patient weights in this patient weight list. So those are the weights in kilograms. Now let's create a new list that will automatically calculate the dose at 0.25 milligrams per kilogram. So we're going to use our for loop again here. So for, and you'll notice here instead of that lowercase I, you have weight. And again, this is just a placeholder, so it doesn't have to be I or weight. You can call that whatever you want to, but it just represents all the items you're going to go through here in the list. So for weight in patient weights kilogram. Now here's the do something part of the code. So dose equals weight times 0.25. And then we're going to append that dose into the empty list. So medication doses milligram dot append the dose that was just calculated each time this for loop goes through. And then we're going to print that list, so it's empty to start, but it should be populated with all of these doses in milligrams for each of these patient weights. And since it's 0.25 milligrams, it should essentially just be 1/4 of each of these numbers. And so if we run that, we can see now we have all of our medication doses in milligrams based on all the patient weights in this list. And so this is just an example of how to use a for loop to go through a list and do some sort of calculation. Now next I have this code review section, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but you'll see code review sections in the Jupyter Notebook. And I'm just going to kind of go through all of this code when I'm going in the video. But if you want to take more time and study the code review is a good block to sort of review what was going on there. So next, let's look at while loops. So these are different than for loops, and they're going to repeat as long as that certain condition is met. And so this loop will just keep going on and on and on until there's a condition that is met. So let's look at a simple example here. We'll say count equals 5. Now this is a different structure than the for loop, so while count is greater than 0, and then the part that's similar will be after you initialize that loop, then it's do something. So in this case, print count, and then we're going to do count -1 each time through. Otherwise, this would just be an indefinite loop because it's just going to keep going because count is always going to be 5. So if it's 5, it's always going to be greater than 0. So if we don't do something to this number, that while loop is just going to keep running on and on and on and on. And we don't want that. And so we're just going to subtract 1 from that number each time it goes through. And we're printing out that count, so we can see here 5, and we just go down to 1 until that condition is met. So 0 is not greater than 0. So when we have 1, -1 is 0. 0 is not greater than 0, so that stops the while loop, and it's just going to exit at that point. So a practical example of a while loop would be monitoring blood sugar levels from a continuous glucose monitor. And so it's going to record these blood glucose measurements at some interval, whether that's 15 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. And it's going to provide alert if the blood sugar is above a specified threshold. So in this case, we're going to say that's 140. So anytime the blood sugar is over 140, you're going to get an alert, and that's the signal to the patient, hey, you need to take action here. So for example, take insulin. And you're going to keep seeing that alert until the blood sugar is less than 140. And so we're going to initialize. You don't need to worry too much about this other code right now. The important part is this while loop. And so this blood sugar level, we're going to start it with some random integer between 100 and 200. While the blood sugar level is greater than the threshold, which is 140, we're going to print this alert, high blood sugar detected, take necessary action. So again, take insulin or something like that. And then each time we're going to mimic the effects of taking insulin by decreasing the blood sugar level by 10. And so whatever this initial value is, every time the loop goes through, we're going to subtract 10 to simulate taking insulin until that blood pressure reading is less than 140. So let's see how this works. Okay, so that was not the best example because our random int was already below the threshold. So let's try this again. We'll get another number. All right, still not working for me. Obviously, when I'm on video, it's not going to work how I want it to. The good thing about random int is that it's just going to keep doing this until we get a number that we want. There we go. All right, the 5th or 6th time is a charm here. Okay, so the while loop here. So the initial random integer that we get is at 180. So each time this while loop goes through, it's greater than 140. So take necessary action. So now the patient would take their insulin. That's going to decrease that by 10, but it's still greater than 140. So that while loop is going to keep going all the way until our blood sugar threshold is reached. So now that it's 140, we're going to get that message. It's under control. It's at 140, so we don't need to do anything anymore. And we have the code review block here to go into that in more detail. But this is an example of a while loop and how you might use that as a practical example. Now I could have set the lower end of the threshold here at maybe 150 or something like that, and that would have guaranteed that we're going to get some number greater than 140, but just for the sake of argument here, we're just initiating that random number just so you could see how that works. And the more times you run that code block or that cell block here, you're going to get a different random number each time. So eventually we got to some number above 140 just to show you how that while loop would work here. All right, in the next section, we're going to review data structures, but for now, that's all on for loops and while loops.